Kia ora everybody. Welcome to today's webinar where we'll be learning all about select statements. Vernon CMS is built on a database called OpenInsight, and the select statements are the inbuilt mechanism in OpenInsight to do searches on the data directly in the database. So the tables or sheets of data that you're saving in the user interface are ending up in lots of different tables, and we can search those tables directly using this command called the select statement. The data that we look within the user interface at is actually often coming from many different tables in the database. Here we can see that I'm on a painting of an albatross with the record data about that. Fields like the title are directly in the object table in the OpenInsight database we use, but many of the other fields, Vernon CMS is actually pulling that data from related tables. For instance, the department, the object record only stores the code or ID of that authority term, and the name of that is dynamically pulled in from the related department table. That allows us to do things like construct a hierarchy, where here we've linked to fine art, and that's in turn linked to a higher level term for art. And it also lets us do editing in those related terms and have that automatically reflected throughout the whole system wherever it's been linked. So if I decided to rename fine arts just to fine art, that would be immediately apparent everywhere through the system because each catalogue record isn't duplicating that information. On the most basic level, we can just do a select statement searching to see if a particular field equals some value that we're looking for. So I could do that on the name field here, the name title field. Select statements are done through the advanced search screen, and it's one of the options on the left. So most often you're just searching on one of the search indexes built directly into Vernon, which are these search fields that are shown on the first tab by default, but we can switch to select statement. And I'll do a simple select statement where I'm selecting records from the object table, our main catalogue record database file, where the name, which is the name title field, equals specifically cat photograph. And if I click on next, I can click on finish. And that's going to bring back that record because that's the only record I have where the name title field exactly matches that content. Now, of course, I could have done that search just simply from the search bar at the top because that's also looking at the name title field. So I could search for fan vase, for instance, and that would bring back that record. We can see what database field that each of these elements on the user interface end up being saved to from the help menu. If I go to help, database information, it'll tell me exactly what's the data file where this information is stored in and what's the internal field name. So we can see we're working at the moment on the object file, and that data is being saved in the name field. It's that internal field ID which you need to use whenever you're constructing select statements. The search that I did on fan vase shows us one example of why we might use a select statement instead. If I did a search on brief description, I can also search for fan vase because that particular record mentioned fan vase in the description as well. So let's search for fan vase in that record. It's found 2 results in this case, and I can finish that search, and I can see I've found 2 different records. The first of the records doesn't specifically have the phrase fan vase. It just says that Queen Elizabeth II was a fan of this particular sculpture's vase. And if I go to the next record, it's that fan vase that we were looking at the first time. And there we can see that it specifically mentions fan vase as a phrase. And so that's a side effect of how Vernon's searching is working behind the scenes. It uses a search index, which is very similar to an index of words that you might have at the back of a book in some cases. And it only knows about the appearance of each specific word. It's taken that brief description and it's broken it down into the individual words, and then it's added an entry in the search index for each of those. So I can find every record that has the word fan, every record that has the word vase, or any record that has both of those. But like with a book index, we no longer know when those two words appear immediately side by side. We just know that each of those words is in this record in that field. If I go back to advanced search and we look at brief description again, the options field lets us see that search index that Vernon's maintaining. So these are every single word that has ever been found in a brief description in our demonstration database. And we'd see fan as one of the words. So that's that particular word indexed. And so we can see a couple of differences here compared to the raw information that's directly in that field. Firstly, we're only seeing the individual words. We're no longer seeing the complete sentences. And secondly, those indexes just store the data in uppercase so that you're not having to worry about getting an exact match for the upper and lower case in the original data. However, in both of those examples, you may actually want to find those cases. You might want to find fan vase only when it appears as two consecutive words, or you may be interested in the exact upper and lower case of the data. And so both of those options are possible with the select statement, because that's looking at the original raw information that's on the catalog record. The search will be much slower because it's looking at each individual catalog record rather than jumping straight to an index, but it lets us do those more subtle types of searches. So let's try that with a select statement on brief description. Firstly, I would need to know what's the field ID of that field. So I can do that again by clicking in the brief description field. And there's actually a shortcut key to that database information. I can use Alt F1 to get to that pop-up we were using before. And from that pop-up, we can see again that's in the object table, and brief _ DESC is the field ID. So let's do a search on that using a select statement. I'll go back to advanced search and I'll use the select statement. The select object part of that statement is required by OpenInsight, but you can leave that off and Vernon CMS automatically adds that on at the beginning for you. So I could just simply say with brief description to save myself some typing. And let's say equals fan vase. Now we'll find that we get no results there. And that's because we've told OpenInsight to find records where that field exactly matches fan vase. We can now try a different kind of search to say we're not looking for exactly matching fan vase. We only want the ones where that field is containing that phrase. So equals to means the entire set of data has to exactly match what you're searching for. Whereas containing finds that block of text and it looks for what phrase you're looking for within that block. So let's go back a step. And containing is another one of the keywords that OpenInsight supports. There is also a punctuation shortcut for that, which is the left and right square bracket. So both of those things mean the same thing. They're shortcuts for looking for a particular field containing a phrase. So now if I click on next, I'm finding only one result, and I can click on next, return to the results, and I've got that fan vase we were looking at before. So now I've excluded that example we saw where Queen Victoria was a fan of this vase, because that record didn't contain exactly that phrase. So that's the first thing that you can do with select statements that's different than normal searches. You can search for individual words in an exact order and find those records. We can also use it to find all the records that have a particular field filled in. You might be wanting to quickly look at what records have used maybe a particularly obscure field in the system. I'm going to use the example of subject event, which isn't used very often, but I know I have the occasional record with that data in my system. I can go back to the advanced search and select statement and say with subject event, which I know is the field ID, and instead of saying equals to or containing something, I can just say with subject event, and it'll find all the records that have got data there. That's found one single result, so I can click on finish. I can bring up the subject and association window where that field appears, and we can see that this particular mug was made in relation to a particular event, and it's been listed as the subject event, which is depicted on the mug. So that was made for the British Empire Games, and that's the logo that's depicted on that mug. So that can be a useful way to find particular records that have got one field filled in, where you think this field isn't often used and you're wanting to quickly get to those. Conversely, we could find all the records that are missing a certain field. So there might be a certain field that you would encourage people to use, but you know that some of the records are missing that data. An example would be the brief description field, that perhaps that should be available for every single record, and you want to jump straight to the records that are missing that so that you can correct those and add a description. So this time I'll use a select statement where I say without. So that's doing the opposite. We're searching for everything without a particular field. So let's say without brief description. And there's two records in my system that are missing that, and I could go back and see that one of those is a periodical, and now I could fill in a brief description there so that all of the records, including those two, have got that information. We can also use select statements to get just a very small sample that has a particular field filled in. And so one of the things that Open Insight supports before the table in the select statement is a maximum number of records to return. So I can say select only 5 records in the object file with a particular field filled in. Maybe I want to review how the collection field has been used on the object records, but I just want to see a quick sample. So I could say select 5 object records with the collection field filled in. And so that's going to be much quicker than searching the entire file, because it doesn't have to read every single object catalog record. It just has to find the first 5 and then come back with those results. So I've found my first 5, and then I can return back to my cataloging screen and check through those records. So one of them's from the Cone collection. There's another one that's part of our permanent collection. So that's a quick way of reviewing data that's in a particular field. We use that ourselves when we're helping people with online access projects. They might be considering what fields are relevant to share to the public. We might come up with a short list of possible fields, and then we would often use select statements to just quickly jump to a subset of records with each of those fields filled in so that we can assess whether the data is actually sensible to put on a public website. We can also do more complex select commands where we search on 2 fields in combination. So there's a keyword for and, where we can use those with and without commands in combination on 2 or more fields. So I'll do a combination of selecting on the department field and the classification field. So I've asked it to select object records where the department equals natural science. And then I can continue that by just saying the keyword and then I just use the same syntax for any other additional field. And I can keep adding more of those if I wish. So I'm going to say and with classification. Sorry, and without classification. So you might have a data standard which says that for your natural science collection, the classification field should always be filled in. But perhaps for other departments like social history, that might often be missing, and so it's not really an issue. So here I can search for those two things in combination, and there's only one single record that's in the natural science department and is also missing the classification field. So there we've got that department, and we can see on tab 2 that the classification field hasn't been filled in. We can in fact see in the title field that the Linnaean classification's been entered. So the classification's actually already known in this case. Somebody just needs to create the authority term and add that into that record. So I could do that on any number of fields. We can also do that on symbolic or calculated fields. One example would be the latest insurance valuation for a record. For the calculated fields, they're not going to appear in the data entry window. They're normally only accessible in the reporting screen. So rather than use that database information tool to look up the field, I'll need to go into the reporting tool to look at what the field ID is of any symbolic field that I'm going to search on. So let's open up the reporting tool, and I can just create a temporary report using fields across the page. From that, I can see every single field that's available in Vernon to report on within the object file, and many of those will be symbolic fields. And so by symbolic fields, I mean fields that it isn't the original data you've typed in, it's the original data with some kind of calculation performed on that, combining data from different files or reworking how that data is presented. The valuation fields are one example of those. So we can see that we've got a whole set of different calculated insurance fields. Internal value latest is one of them. There's also an insurance value latest. And when I report on those fields, the cog icon or the detail page lets me see exactly what the field ID is of that field is. So that's a built-in field in Vernon CMS that takes the whole valuation history for the object and then calculates the latest insurance value based on the dates in that history. And so those calculated fields can also be searched on in a select statement. So I'm just going to copy that field ID. And then we'll do another select statement on that particular field. Again, I could do a more complex search where I search on several fields in combination. So I'm actually going to search for selecting object where the object type is periodical and without that particular calculated field filled in. And so that's going to find everything that's been classed as a periodical that doesn't yet have a valuation. So I've clicked on next and it's found one result. And so what I'm going to show here is a trap that we have within select statements. If we open up the valuation screen, this particular periodical has been valued. It's just that the valuation has come out at $0. when we do the without command, OpenInsight considers 0 to be equivalent to nothing. And so that's considered to be a field where it doesn't yet have any information. And so that's a case where we might not actually want it to show those results where $0 has been entered, that we interpret that as actually being a valuation. And so I can do a subtle difference in the select statement to distinguish between completely empty versus ones where it's got 0 entered into that field. So I'm going to do that same select command, but with a slight variation. Instead of saying without, I've said with that particular field equals empty quotes. And so that specifically tells it to only find the ones where that field is completely empty. So it doesn't even have the number 0 in it. So there may be some cases where you specifically need to find completely empty, and there may be records that have just the number 0 entered into it. So that's quite an edge case, but it does occasionally come up. So if I click on next now, it'll find no results because every single periodical does have a valuation. It's just that one of those happens to be $0. We can also do case-sensitive searching, which I mentioned when we were looking at the keywords in the brief description file. Maybe we've got a case where some person records have been entered with last names in uppercase, and you remember seeing that example, but you can't easily get to those records. I could open up the person data entry screen, and I can again use select statements on that file. So every file within Vernon supports using select statements. You'll just be changing the table in that select command. So I could instead say select person with, and I could say last name, which is the field where I know the last name is recorded, and I can say equals Smith. And that's found 5 records. By default, the select statements are case insensitive, the same as the rest of the searching in Vernon, but we can override that search to say that we want to do a case sensitive search. So let's go back a step and edit that. And I can instead change that to case sends as the keyword. And so that's now found only 1 record because a case-sensitive search on last name finds only this 1 record, which has got the surname entered in only uppercase. So there may be cases where you specifically need to find a particular keyword in a field where it's been entered in the wrong case, and a select statement would enable you to do that. Another example of a calculated field is in the photo file in Vernon. The photo file doesn't specifically have a field that lists what objects are linked to each of those photos. So if we're in the data entry window, you won't ever see a field where it lists all the objects currently linked to it, but you may be wanting to find the photos that are effectively orphan records and aren't linked to any object within the system. We can do that again with one of the built-in symbolic fields in Vernon. If we look at the reporting screen, and we again list all of the fields that are possible to review in the across the page format, we'll see there is actually a field for related objects. And so that's another built-in symbolic or calculated field, and I can view the details of that to see that ob_rel is the name of that symbolic field ID. So I can use that ob_rel field in a select statement to find all of the photo records that aren't linked to any objects. Some of those photos might actually be linked to other files, like to a condition report, but this will specifically find ones that aren't related to any object record. So let's try that out. I'll go back to my photo screen and again do an advanced search. And I'll use that without command that we've been doing before. So I can just say without ob_rel and click on next. Now that will take a long time because not only does it have to look at every individual photo record, on each of those photo records, it's then calculating what are all the current objects linked to each of those photos. So it will take it a wee while to work through, but it's found 43 records that aren't currently linked to any objects. And in our demo system, there are lots of historically broken image links that we've later added a new photo record that properly links to where the images now are, but we just haven't tidied up those orphan records. And so that's a way that we can find those and then possibly take some kind of action on those records. One of the other special calculated fields that are built into Vernon are the valuation financial year period calculations. That's something that system supervisors can set up so that you can then report on valuations as at the opening or ending of a financial year. The setup of those is through the customized configuration page. Within that, there's a tab for a whole lot of settings to do with valuation within Vernon CMS. And the opening period and closing period dates are part of that. So at the moment, I've got it set up that the previous financial year for Australian financial years is the last one recorded. And so if I was to do a report, I can report on opening valuation or closing valuation, and these are the dates that it will use. If I go into reporting, I'll just show you where those fields appear. So again, I'll list all of the across the page fields that are available. And in that list, I'll see all of those valuation fields further down. So we can see here this whole batch of opening fields and the whole batch of closing fields. So that's looking through the valuation history of each object, and it's giving you the valuation at that point in time. So if you said to show me all of the insurance value closing dates, it would look at that second date field that we saw a second ago. And so I can again look at doing a select statement on one of those calculated fields. So if we looked at the opening valuation, again, I can use the detail field to see what that field is. And we can see that's OBSIM opening ins for insurance valuation. And so I could then use that in a select statement to find all of the objects that perhaps had a valuation within a particular range. So let's do a select statement looking for records that have particular valuations in that period. So I could say with OBSIM opening ins valuation, and as well as equal to, we can use a variety of mathematical symbols like greater than and less than. So I could say less than a certain amount, and we can also use a keyword for between, and that's what I'm going to use in this case. So let's say we want all of the valuations that are between $10 and $50, and that's found 9 records. And if we look at the valuations, we'll be able to see that all of them, as at last financial year, had valuations that were between $10 and $50. That idea of searching on symbolic fields also works on any that you've set up yourself, custom within your own system. One of the examples that I've already got set up is I've got a symbolic field to count how many related photographs there are for each object record. This particular soap, for instance, has a photograph of the box, and then it also has a photo of the two parts of that separated, the actual historic soap and the box that it's contained in. So that's an image, that's a record, sorry, that's got two images attached to it, and we might be interested in finding all of the object records that have got at least two images. I've set up a calculated field to do that count, and then I can do a select statement to search on that. So let's just look at the symbolic field first. And so the field ID for each symbolic field is in that first column. So the new one I've set up is user underscore sim underscore 39, and I've just called it photo AV count. And so that's using one of the built-in commands to just count the number of values or the number of entries in a particular field. So it's looking at the AV field, just the photo AV link field. And if I did a sample record, so let's say we're looking at that soap, and so if I calculate that, we can see that it's coming back with a count of 2. So that's now a number field that I could do one of these mathematical symbols to search for ones that are greater or less than a certain amount. So we just have to remember that user sim 39 was the particular symbolic we're looking for. And I can again go back to my advanced search and say with user sim 39, and maybe we're only interested in the ones that have got more than one photo link. And so there's 92 records. So that's more than perhaps I would have thought. But when we come back to here, we'll see all of those variations. So there'll be some cases where we've just got a detail image of part of that object, or ones where it was maybe a photo of the cover and then the inside, or from different angles of that object. So that might help you find, again, edge cases. We had a client where they knew they had some records with more than 50 images, and they were causing problems in different reports. And so that's something where you could then do the same select command and say, find me all of the things with more than 50, and narrow down straight to those records. So that covers all of the range of typical select commands that we run into. There is full built-in help for select commands, and you can access that from the same advanced search screen. So if I click on advanced search, when I'm on the page that I'm entering the select statement, I can just press F1 for help, and at that point it would jump off to the help website where we've got all of these different variations documented. If you've got a specific case where you can't work out how to do the select statement, you can always contact our support team and we'll be able to give you examples of how that works. Thanks very much, everybody.